The Mormon Church has historically maintained a rigid and damaging stance on issues related to sexual orientation, with particular cruelty reserved for same-sex relationships. Leadership within the church has, for decades, equated homosexual behavior with the gravest of sins, at times drawing grotesque comparisons between same-sex love and acts such as child molestation. Such statements were not isolated incidents but part of a sustained campaign that instilled fear, guilt, and self-loathing in countless individuals, particularly vulnerable youth who found themselves at the intersection of religious indoctrination and personal identity. The psychological burden imposed by these teachings is incalculable. Young people, desperate for familial acceptance and community belonging, were told unequivocally that their capacity for love made them comparable to criminals in the eyes of God. This distortion of morality did not merely alienate them. It condemned them to lives of secrecy, shame, and often profound loneliness. The mental health repercussions were immediate and lasting: depression, anxiety, identity fragmentation, and in the worst cases, death by self-inflicted means. The Church's cruelty lay not only in its words but in the systemic mechanisms it built to enforce those words, ensuring that generations of LGBTQ individuals internalized a deep-seated belief in their own unworthiness. While the Church has made minor public relations adjustments in recent years, distinguishing same-sex attraction from behavior, the underlying structure remains unchanged. Acting on same-sex love is still considered a sin, and therefore LGBTQ members are still treated as defective beings in need of containment or correction. The rhetorical shift is cosmetic, designed to soften external criticism while continuing the internal devastation of its own members. The legacy of harm remains untouched, unaddressed, and unforgiven. The expectation placed upon LGBTQ members to live celibate, loveless lives in order to prove their faithfulness is nothing less than a cruel sentence to emotional and relational starvation. To demand that human beings deny themselves the basic experiences of love, intimacy, companionship, and family under the threat of divine condemnation is a form of psychological violence. It is a calculated form of spiritual abuse, designed to fracture the self, to pit a person's need for love against their need for survival within their family and community. For countless young individuals raised in this environment, the reality is one of crushing isolation. They learn early that expressing who they are, loving who they love, will lead to exclusion, shame, and potentially expulsion. Many are forced to live double lives, constructing intricate facades of compliance and purity while hiding their authentic selves. These hidden lives are not signs of deception but acts of survival. They are desperate attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable, the need for human connection with the terror of rejection and eternal damnation. The Mormon Church's policies and rhetoric have cost people their mental health, their relationships, and in too many cases, their very lives. The refusal to acknowledge or take responsibility for this damage is not merely negligent, it is criminal. It reveals a system more concerned with the preservation of dogma and power than with the well-being of its most vulnerable members. Religious freedom is often invoked to shield these teachings from scrutiny, but the invocation is dishonest. Freedom of religion should never serve as a pretext for systemic psychological abuse. The broader society must grapple with the reality that while religious organizations are protected in their right to believe, they should not be protected in their right to destroy lives under the guise of belief. No other institution would be allowed to operate with such impunity. In any other context, an organization that systematically taught children that their core identity was equivalent to criminality would be considered a danger to public health. It would face inquiries, lawsuits, and public outrage. But religious institutions, particularly ones as wealthy and influential as the Mormon Church, enjoy a grotesque level of impunity. Their leaders can stand at pulpits and deliver sermons that destroy minds and spirits, and yet face no real consequence. This hypocrisy must end. It is essential to name the impact clearly. The Mormon Church has been, and continues to be, a primary driver of psychological suffering among LGBTQ youth within its sphere of influence. The doctrine may wear the robes of piety, but its fruits are despair, alienation, and trauma. There is no sanctity in a system that teaches children to hate themselves. There is no holiness in a theology that demands the suppression of love. The devastation wrought by these teachings is visible in the broken lives of those who grew up under their weight. Adults who carry the scars of years spent believing they were monstrous. Families torn apart when children, unable to live under the crushing burden of expectation, are driven from their homes. Communities that continue to value rigid conformity over human compassion. Moreover, it is important to emphasize that the softening of rhetoric does nothing to repair the harm already done. Apologies, even if they were offered, and they have not been, could never be enough. Real atonement would require systemic change, a full repudiation of past teachings, a complete restructuring of current doctrine, and material support for those whose lives were shattered. None of this has happened. None of this is even seriously contemplated by church leadership. Thus, the harm continues, repackaged in slightly more palatable language, but no less lethal in effect. The youth growing up in Mormon homes today are still taught that their love must be denied, that their futures must be barren of romantic partnership unless they conform to heteronormative models they cannot authentically inhabit. The message remains: you are broken. You must either fix yourself or live unloved. There is no moral high ground in this. There is only cruelty disguised as conviction, hatred masquerading as holiness. The mental well-being of every LGBTQ person touched by these teachings is at risk, and every day that the institution refuses to change is another day it deepens its culpability. No amount of community service, no volume of charitable donations, no surface-level statements of compassion can erase this reality. A tree is known by its fruit. The fruit of the Mormon Church's stance on LGBTQ people is rotten, poisonous, and deadly. The only moral response to this ongoing harm is to call it out with unflinching clarity, to refuse to allow religious privilege to obscure human suffering. In confronting the Mormon Church's historical and ongoing abuse of LGBTQ individuals, there must be no mercy, no soft words, no excusing it as a product of its time, when the suffering is not a matter of history but of daily lived experience. The victims of this institution's teachings deserve the full force of truth spoken on their behalf. They deserve recognition of the mental anguish inflicted upon them by doctrines that equated their existence with sin. They deserve acknowledgement of the terror and despair that clouded their youth, the broken families that resulted, the lost futures, the stunted lives. They deserve more than platitudes. They deserve accountability. The mental health of a young person is not a negotiable collateral of religious doctrine. It is a human right. To systematically undermine that right in the name of God is not an act of faith. It is an act of violence. The Mormon Church has waged a war against the self-worth of LGBTQ individuals for generations. It has destroyed families in the name of righteousness. It has pushed children into despair in the name of purity. It has demanded celibacy, loneliness, invisibility, and self-erasure as the price for belonging. And it continues to do so, hiding behind a facade of loving the sinner, while simultaneously declaring that to love authentically is to sin. There is no love in this. There is only manipulation and harm. The mental well-being of every human being matters more than any institution, any dogma, any imagined divine edict. The health, happiness, and humanity of LGBTQ individuals are not optional footnotes in a theological debate. They are the very core of what any decent, ethical society must defend. The Mormon Church has failed this fundamental test of decency. It continues to fail it. And until it is held accountable, until the full scope of its damage is named and addressed without compromise or hesitation, it will remain a monument not to faith but to cruelty. No amount of sanitized language or cosmetic policy shifts can obscure the truth. The Mormon Church's treatment of LGBTQ individuals is a stain that no amount of good works can erase. Its impact is written in the broken hearts and shattered lives of those it was supposed to shepherd and protect. This must be said without fear, without apology, and without mercy, because the cost of silence is too high, and the price of polite equivocation is paid in human suffering. The truth, unvarnished, is the only justice left to offer.